Before we get started, I wanted to warn sensitive listeners that this episode is about hanging and taking of people's lives.
Bring the museum back to life.
You know, people sit out on the front porch hoping people will come by.
Go forth and do good. It's insane. I have the most understanding wife in the world.
I treat everybody the same thing.
Oh, that's the other thing I love about Marietta. It's like a melting pot.
You are listening to Marietta Stories. Each week, veteran podcaster Bill Nowicki brings you the heartwarming, interesting, and fun stories from the people that make the community of Marietta, Georgia, a place to call home. Here's your host, Bill Nowicki.
Kaaren Tramonte is here, and she had a posting, I think it was on a Facebook group, about the Hanging Hill in Marietta. So I was fascinated with that, and I contacted her, and she's in the studio. And I want to thank Ignite HQ here on Waddell Street in Marietta for allowing me to use their studio. Kaaren, welcome to Marietta Stories Podcast.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm excited to hear. Well, let's talk a little bit about you. How did you get involved in history? Are you from this area?
No, we moved here from New Orleans 5 years ago. And I'm not really versed in Marietta history per se, but I know like everything there is to know about Powder Springs. And when I was researching historic crime for my haunted history tours over there, it kind of led me into Marietta, and that's where the hanging thing came into play and what I'm starting to research in now.
So are you saying that Marietta was the place to go in Cobb County for hangings? I mean, is that where they did the hangings for Cobb County?
Yes.
Wow.
When the county was established in 1850 and law was put into order, they started trying to prevent lynchings out in the rural areas. So anytime like something went down, they would take the people, like the law would try to like swoop in and be like, no, we need justice here, and bring all the criminals or anybody accused of a crime to Marietta, to the courthouse to have a fair trial. And then if they were convicted, they were sentenced to hang.
I wonder what happens when they weren't convicted.
Right. That's when Yeah.
Well, we won't go into that. So what's the name of your company? You were talking about it for a second.
It's called Blendin, Georgia, Ghost Tours. It's all about Powder Springs, really. This past year, I started branching out into Cobb and the surrounding areas, and we did like a ghost hunt at the Kennesaw House, and we do spirit nights in different locations, but, just pretty much showcasing the museum and the history of Powder Springs with the ghost tours.
Cool. Well, the Hangman's Hill story was interesting to me because it seemed like people didn't even know that was a thing or didn't know it existed. So tell me what you found out about Hangman's Hill in Marietta, like general location. Okay.
So what I'm thinking is Hangman's Hill Cemetery was a location of Hangman's Hill, because it even shows on the Marietta government website that Hangman's Hill Cemetery in the location between St. James and St. Mary Street on Kennesaw Avenue. And it says on there that there's about 14 or 15 convicted criminals buried there, but they're not marked. There's only a couple marked with field stones. But there's no sign out there that like shows it's a cemetery. It's literally like in someone's backyard, like it's private property. You would drive by and never know it was there.
So there's probably bones and stuff?
Yeah, total skeletons under there.
Did you bang on the door of the person's house?
No, God, no. When I went out there, I parked on a side street, like on St. James, and I was looking around. I'm like, wow, I bet you these people have no idea. Like, they literally are feet away from, like, horrible thing that happened in the past, gallows getting put up on this hill and people being hung and buried here.
Do you have an idea whether it was like a permanent gallows? I guess it would be semi-permanent, like a wooden structure thing, right?
I've seen in the newspaper clippings that they would literally build the gallows because there wasn't like hangings every week or every month, Like by the time 1890 came along, there was only 6 hangings that had taken place in Cobb County since 1850. So
how many?
6.
Oh.
6 convicted criminals hung like legally.
I got you.
So they went out and built the gallows and
I got you. I didn't realize, but the hangman's job was pretty interesting, where to make it humane, they had to calculate the length of the rope and how far the drop was. And do you know any of that information?
What I know about a hangman was it was kind of like a prominent position back in the 1800s. Like, think of it like they literally had to murder people for their job, and they had to go in and approach it with this like solemn face and like a respectable manner. I think they only let them hang for 7 minutes. Hangings in Marietta were taking place like Fridays at 11 a.m. was like the hanging time in Marietta.
But it's also, we have that now with executions. It has to be done. It's almost like a sterile environment thing, and how it's done has to follow a certain course. But I was fascinated, like the hangman's knot and how far they drop and their weight, because they want them, probably not good for kids to hear, but they wanted them to not be decapitated, but they also they wanted to break their neck.
Right.
And it's like, oh
yeah, that it's totally gruesome. It was better for the person being hung if their neck broke when they dropped, because they wouldn't struggle.
Right.
And it wouldn't be like, ugh,
All right, so let's hear from what accounts do you have in the newspapers about Hangman's Hill? So she's going to her phone.
Yeah, I have my clippings.
Now, how did you find these clippings, just for people to...
Okay, so this is one thing I really wanted to tell people to do. At first, I started out with Google, of course. Everyone goes to a Google search, and then you could dig into like family search and all the, stuff that you find, like historic stuff in. But newspapers.com has literally, you could search every newspaper in the U.S.
Didn't know that.
Through time, and you can even put keywords in for like things you want to know. I punched in like the case I knew about that was hung at Hangman's Hill, and it popped up, and then all the other Hangman's Hill stuff popped up. So I was like, woohoo, because I couldn't find that before. I had a subscription to the MDJ's historic newspaper, and I couldn't find anything about the hangings, and I was like, why? Well, it's in the AJC. That's why.
There you go. That's funny. It wouldn't be covered by the local paper, though.
Right. I think they came along later, like 1880s or 1890s.
Oh, I see what you mean. Yeah.
So they didn't have that.
All right. So this is from the AJC. What's the date on it?
The first thing I found was August 30th, 1900. And this is a case, Sam Robinson. It says, where Sam Robinson will be hanged next Saturday. And it talks about the hanging, like what he did.
What did he do?
He was punished for an assault he made on a Miss Inzer, a white woman. It was an African American male, and he was accused of assaulting a white woman in town. And so they sentenced him to hang. It states like 2 hangings have occurred at this place within the last 30 years. So this is in 1900 talking about that. And it mentions that Dave Long was hanged there for murder just after the war, and then a Pink Pratt on the same spot in March 4th, 1881 for the offense of rape. What's interesting is there's also articles that talk about hangings on College Hill. So I was like, College Hill, what is that, And I started researching more, and it was on the grounds of the old Georgia Military Institute. And which
is the Hilton these days.
Right. And so I was like looking into that. It's like the campus was like 120 acres. So, I mean, I'm sure they didn't hang them right there on the street in front of the campus, because that's kind of like weird, and people were like weird about it back then, too. So it describes like a location on the grounds, but Hangman's Hill Cemetery is also located on those old grounds because it was a huge campus. So it's like, is there 2 locations? Is there, are they calling College Hill Hangman's Hill and they changed it? Like, you never know,
Right,
So it's a mystery.
Do you have any more newspaper clippings you'd like to share?
The Lingo crime. So this is a case, the one that led me to finding out about Hangman's Hill. And he was actually a white man from Powder Springs that was brought to Marietta and tried and convicted. But the thing about him is, like, his family was a very prominent family in the area and really well known. His dad was actually like a really awesome preacher, Baptist preacher. Yeah, he ended up committing a murder, which was against his brother-in-law. So they drug him up here to Marietta. He had his trial, and he was hung on Hangman's Hill.
How much time do you get a sense for how much time it took to convict him and then when it was hanged?
So I don't really know if there was like a set amount
Was
of
it
time.
a speedy trial kind of thing?
I guess some were like cut and dry, just like today, but some took longer. But like the Lingo case carried on, like it got rescheduled like throughout the year, like a couple times, and it was like the first like huge case in Cobb County. Like everybody was like,
oh, I bet.
Take tabs on this. Like there was even like I found like letters online, like people had posted that they found of their like great grandma or something, and they were like referencing the Lingo trial. Like, yeah, I'm gonna go out there to Texas probably about 4 days after Lingo's hung, and I'm
I see. It was like
it was
9/11 maybe for that time. Wow.
It was the big thing.
Yeah. I'm trying to picture what it would be like here, and I suspect because they were still houses on Kennesaw Avenue, so it wasn't that far from the population. You wouldn't think.
Like in the 1800s on the Hill, it was up to the judge. Like they passed this law where the judge decided if it was public or private. And so there were some cases where he was like, no, this is going to be a private hanging. And there's a newspaper clipping that I have from like the 1880s or something where like thousands had turned out from Marietta. Like thousands of people out there. It was like the liquor was freely flowing and people were ready to see this. And they even had their children out there like, this is why, trying to teach them a lesson. This is why you don't do these things. And when he said it was going to be a private hanging, the crowd got so angry they literally like ripped down the fencing board around the gallows so they could see him hang.
Oh yeah. Anything else that you wanted to share about what you?
I mean, that's pretty as far as I've gotten. I've been up to the deed room. There's a superstition that if you allowed someone to hang on your property, that bad luck would come to you, your family, and your business. So people are like, I don't want, I don't want anyone hanging on my property. And this D.N. Anderson guy stepped up and was like, okay, yeah, y'all can have this. So I went into the deed room and looking up like D.N. Anderson and like what properties he had available. And I was hoping to see like something that he got from the state because after the GMI like dissolved, he bought the property. He bought like parcels out of their acre, out of their campus. So I was like, hopefully I would see like a state, lessor, giving him property. And I didn't find anything. I was still like other people's names. So I was like, and this guy was like a property hoarder. Like he had so much property. He was going to all the sheriff's tax sales and stuff like that and buying them all up. So I was like, crapola. This is going to be hard.
Well, maybe someone will hear this and have some information about that. Yeah.
I really want, that was the whole purpose of putting it up there because there's so much that people just aren't even aware of, don't even know that happened. Like even back in the 1800s and stuff, like if it wasn't passed down, then how do you know, and it needs to be known.
Right. I agree. And it's such a complicated history here in the South with the Confederate slavery and all that stuff.
Right. And I know it's like a taboo thing to kind of talk about and put out there, and people aren't proud of of course, having hangings happen, but it happened in every town all over the country.
Yeah,
it's not just...
It's not exclusive to Marietta. I got to talk to some of the real estate agents at Johnny Walker Realty. One of them was Shannon Van Horn, and this is what she had to say about working with Johnny and Carrie.
I've been with a couple different brokers, but this is by far my favorite. Literally nothing that they haven't been able to find an answer for me. If they don't have the answer, they're going to talk to each other and figure out an answer and then get back to us. When I tell people that I'm now at Johnny Walker Realty, there's nobody that doesn't know who they are. So that's nice.
Real estate agents that are happy do better for their clients and the business. That's what I think is helping Johnny Walker Realty grow so quickly. Remember, they're at 262 Church Street, just down from the square. Check them out. I wanted to learn more about the Albert Lingo case, so I reached out to Christa McCay, and here's what she had to say. Here I have Kristen Mckay, the collections manager at Marietta Museum of History, and she has a little bit more information about Hangman's Hill and a specific issue. Hey, Krista.
Hey, how are you, Bill?
Good. So tell me about Mr. Lingo, Albert Lingo.
Albert Lingo was born sometime around 1837 in kind of the Powder Springs area of Cobb County. He was the son of Pinkerton, I love that name, and Eppie Lingo.
Really? Pinkerton?
Pinkerton, isn't that a great name? Pinkerton Lingo.
back then this area was just I guess the railroad was in, right? Back then.
It was coming in Marietta, but where Albert's family was in like South Cobb and Powder Springs, they didn't really have a railroad just yet.
Mm-hmm.
In the 1830s and 40s, Marietta was still the bigger town. It wasn't a city just yet. And then Powder Springs was like the second biggest town in the county at that time. And there were a lot of connections family-wise between Marietta and Powder Springs. That Powder Springs Road that still exists today, that was the connecting point between the two towns, and people could, take their horse and buggy back and forth. Albert Lingo actually had a younger sister named Sarah Frances, and she's really the center, the story, because Sarah married a man named Robert Duncan, and Albert was not happy with that because Robert had been accused of stealing a mule from a local in Powder Springs. And so that stealing of the mule put Robert Duncan, in Albert's view, as a, not a good man for his sister to marry. Mm. He was a thief, and so his sister shouldn't be marrying a thief. And Albert was quoted as saying that he would rather die and go to hell, if there was such a place, than have it thrown up to him that his sister had married a horse thief. Mm. So Albert was really unhappy with this marriage, and he knew that his mother was very upset by this too. And so this is all occurring in April of 1858. So Albert's about 21, his sister's about 18. Robert Duncan is about the same, somewhere in his early 20s. With all of this happening, this kind of bad blood, it becomes one of those things where Albert decides that he is going to, quote, take Robert Duncan's heart's blood with a spear. And if he didn't do it that day, he was going to do it that evening. And so people around town are hearing Albert say this. They're seeing him sharpen a knife and just grumbling about how Robert Duncan wasn't worthy of his sister because he was a horse thief. And as the story goes, a couple days after his sister gets married, and he finally confronts Robert Duncan outside of a bowling alley of all places, and proceeds to run after Duncan, chasing him, and eventually stabs him in the streets of downtown Powder Springs. What ended up happening was other townspeople split them up, and Robert Duncan laid there bleeding, and a person had asked Lingo, I think you killed him, and Lingo's reply was, I don't care a damn if I had. And this then leads to a court trial. The court trial then finds Albert Lingo guilty. This is about October of 1858. So justice came pretty swift. 6 months from the murder to him being found guilty. What ended up happening is Albert then is found guilty and is sentenced to hang on Hangman's Hill, which is located just off Kennesaw Avenue on private property. At Hangman's Hill, Albert was asked, do you have one last request? And his last request was to be buried in a chestnut coffin so that he would go through hell a-poppin', because chestnuts pop in the fires of hell, and so that's why he wanted a chestnut coffin.
Crazy.
I know, it is crazy. And then the other story that I had heard as well, the sheriff at the time, Sheriff Barnett, he did not want to be the one to pull the cord to hang Albert Lingo. He just felt, as a Christian, that would not be something he could do. So one of his deputies, a man named Henry Husk, was the one to do it. And when he saw what had happened after pulling that cord and the floor dropping out, Henry Husk just went into fits, was overcome with what he had done, and was pulled away from the crowd screaming and ranting and raving of what he had done, and such, ending someone's life like that. He didn't realize the consequences. That case also was the case that led to a number of Georgia Military Institute cadets being expelled because they stayed out too long. They only had a 1 hour pass to go see or to go hear the verdict, and they stayed out too long, about 12 hours, and some of them came back drunk, and it led to the expulsion of Georgia Military Institute cadets. So this was a case that involved murder. It involved cadets being expelled from the Georgia Military Institute. It involved the madness of Henry Husk. He went to the Georgia Sanitarium down in Milledgeville.
Wow. And speaking of death and things like that, you have a tour coming up.
I do. I actually have tours in October, Saturday, October 6th, Saturday, October 20th, and October 27th as well in the city cemetery. I'm going to be focusing on the younger people that are in the city cemetery, so anybody who is under the age of 40, that'll be the first tour. The second tour will be those early pioneering Mariettans, and then the last tour is actually going to be World War I veterans because we are in the 100th anniversary of the end of World War I. So I thought it'd be great to talk about those veterans as well.
Right, and how do they get tickets?
They can get tickets through touchstones2thepast.eventbrite.com. That's a little long, I know, but you can go through Marietta Museum of History on Facebook or mariettahistory.org, which is our website, and it's on there too. Or they can come up to the museum and get tickets, and they're $15 per person. These aren't ghost tours. They're history-based tours, but I am more than happy to, kind of tell a story or two while anybody's out there with me.
Great. And I'll put the link in the show notes so folks can find it easily.
Perfect. Thank you.
Great. Well, thanks, as always, Christa, for all you do for Marietta, and that was a great story.
Thank you, Bill, for having me again. I appreciate it.
All right. So if you know any more about any of these stories at Hangman's Hill, go to mariettastories.com or the Facebook page for Marietta Stories and give us a comment about the show. And thanks so much to Kaaren Tramonte and Kristen Mckay for their great interviews. And this is Bill Nowicki for Marietta Stories Podcast. Check out next week's show, will you?